One thing I don't really like is how certain academics end up limiting the Cold War as merely an ideological dispute between capitalism and socialism, and here I say that it wasn't quite like that. I think the ideological factor is overrated. The Cold War is above all a geopolitical dispute, and that's what's most important. Ideology matters, but not that much. Actually, I would consider it secondary. Ideology is much less than the motivation of the Cold War. It would actually be more like a tool. The ideal is to see the Cold War as a dispute between two centers of power for geopolitical supremacy of the planet, Washington and Moscow, the United States and the Soviet Union. Ideology, therefore, was the tool with which these two poles could fight. So, it's not capitalism or socialism as the motivation. They were important, of course, but they were the means these two poles had to fight. With capitalism winning simply because it is a political and economic tool that is far more efficient than socialism could ever be. With these two centers, Washington and Moscow, competing for the world after the loss of power of the other two blocs that had competed until then: London, Paris, Berlin, and on a smaller scale, Tokyo and Beijing. And why do I think it's more important to look through the geopolitical perspective instead of ideology? Well, I'll give you two reasons. The first reason is that when you look through ideological lenses, they blind you to reality, which always is and always will be about the struggle for power and influence among major powers. If motivation were purely ideological, the communist bloc would have been more united and achieved better results. Not that it would have won the war, I don't think it would have, because socialism simply can't work, but maybe it would have lasted longer and caused more damage to the Western world. In fact, I understand why people see it only through the ideological lens. After all, that's how 99.9% of the books and documents from that time treat it, but personally I think that's very shallow and narrow-minded. Especially because I like to see things from a broader perspective over time. And honestly, 45 years of Cold War is simply a ridiculously short period within the perspective of humanity and our civilization, which we can estimate to be around 20,000 years. I find it unlikely that historians in the future, around the year 2800 or 2900, will see those 45 years of Cold War with the same level of importance that we give them. Of course, there's the nuclear factor, which is the most vital element of the Cold War and is what makes it what it is. After all, it was the first conflict up until then where there was a risk of annihilating humanity itself. But from now on, we'll have situations with the same level of tension, or maybe even more. So, in hundreds of years, given the larger scale of weapons and geopolitical dimensions, it will become clear that the Cold War, within this arc of thousands of years, won't have the importance we give it today. Of course, someone might say that's obvious because in the future they'll be further away and won't have as many effects. But the fact is that even when we look back at other key periods in humanity, there are times that had a very big impact on society. And civilization as a whole may be much greater than the Cold War, like for example the 30 Years' War in the 17th century. Or even the Mongol conquest, which even after almost 1,000 years still have a key importance today within the context of human history. This ideological perspective only makes sense within this small context, which is the 20th century, especially because, looking back, we can see this clearly. The factor of ideological disputes only makes sense if there really had been some balance of power between these two political, economic, ideological systems, socialism and capitalism. But today we know that wasn't the case, especially the fact that the socialist bloc didn't stand a chance of winning that dispute. Looking back, it's obvious now, but it wasn't at the time. Anyone in the West, especially in the United States, who was around in the late 50s and in the early 60s, looking at the numbers and maps, anyone would be terrified by the imminent and inevitable socialist victory led by Moscow because Soviet industrial growth was overwhelming. the gross domestic product growth as well, not to mention that their science seemed superior, putting the first satellite in space and then the first man. Not to mention almost 6 million. Of soldiers, 45,000 tanks, 20,000 Warsaw Pact aircraft, which were much higher numbers than what NATO had. Especially because this didn't even take into account the possible reinforcements coming from China and probably from the Indians, who, despite claiming to be neutral, flirted with and cooperated with the Soviets. So, from that point of view, it seemed that an American and NATO defeat would be inevitable. That the Soviet Union in a few days would take West Germany and Denmark, and in a few weeks most of France, Italy, the Netherlands, Belgium and Greece. And on top of that, they saw pro-Soviet movements popping up in Latin America. North Africa and the Middle East in practice had already been lost, and the rest of Africa would hardly fail to lean toward the Soviet side. In Southeast Asia, the panic was that if the communists won in Vietnam, it would be inevitable for the whole region to fall, like a domino effect. And it's worth remembering that the United States was still traumatized by the Korean War, which, although technically a tie, in practice ended up being a victory for China. And I say it was a victory for China because the United States, supported by a United Nations coalition and as a nuclear power, had been easily defeating North Korea after pushing the North Koreans back behind the 38th parallel, which is the line that divides the Korean peninsula between North Korea and South Korea. So, the American forces and their allies were almost collapsing the North Korean army until all of a sudden they faced a Chinese avalanche that pushed the world's greatest military power, the United States, which still had the support of several Western allies, back into South Korea again. The impression of imminent defeat before the Chinese forces was so strong that MacArthur, the American commander in the war, was determined to use nuclear weapons against China because Moscow soon realized that the Chinese would not be able to hold out much longer. So Moscow, thinking it would be defeated, and Washington also thinking it would be defeated, decided to negotiate. And the war practically ended, although technically it didn't, but anyway, in practice that war ended there. It's under an armistice today, but that's another topic. Both sides only negotiated because both sides thought they were going to lose. The same thing happened in the missile crisis. Both sides thought they were going to be defeated, so they sat down and talked. This actually makes the current situation between Russia and NATO much more serious, because both sides think they're going to win, and if they think they're going to win, there's no reason to negotiate. But going back to the Cold War, the Americans were traumatized by the Korean War, and throughout the rest of the 50s and 60s they were sure that if there was a war, they would be defeated. But today, looking at the data, numbers, reports and everything else, we know that's not the case. That, in fact, the communist countries didn't have the strength they appeared to have, and they weren't that supportive of each other. In fact, the Soviet Union and China didn't trust each other, and eventually they all ended up wanting to fight each other. This actually became clear when China invaded the Soviet Union in 1969 at the Gusuli River, mobilizing hundreds of thousands on both sides and almost starting a war between the Soviet Union and China. Besides that, the Soviet economy, which was growing at an alarming rate in the 1950s, suddenly stopped growing. And the estimate that Soviet industrial production, which had been growing rapidly, quickly stagnated in the 1960s, not even coming close to that of the United States. Besides that, Soviet technology gradually became obsolete compared to American technology, and that absurd number of soldiers, tanks and planes became a huge burden for Moscow to sustain. Trying to keep up with the pace of capitalist United States only accelerated the decline of the Soviet economy even more. The same thing didn't happen with China because the Chinese, who historically are a nation of merchants, realized the socialist fiasco and changed their economy by embracing capitalism. But even if, by some miracle, the Soviet Union had done the same thing and left socialism, it's still quite clear that the United States and the Soviet Union would continue to maintain their geopolitical disputes. Because what was at stake was seeing which center of power would reign supreme, Moscow or Washington. So again, ideology was just the way each side carried out its attempt to surpass the opponent, but there was no real motivation. The Cold War would have happened anyway, but in some different way. Which brings us to the most important part of this video, which is the second reason. Because actually, the Cold War and the current one, which the media calls the Second Cold War, from both a historical, anthropological, and geopolitical perspective, wouldn't really be exactly that. Because it would make more sense to call the traditional Cold War, the one between the United States and the Soviet Union, the Second Great Game, and this current one between the United States and China, which they call the Second Cold War, the Third Great Game. The so-called Great Game was the rivalry between the British and Russian empires in the 19th century for influence in Central Asia, mainly in Afghanistan, Persia, and Tibet. The two empires intervened militarily and applied diplomatic pressure on territories in Central and South Asia. Russia was marching southward, and Great Britain from the Indian subcontinent used the territory as a platform to control the Indian and Pacific Oceans, projecting its power in Africa and Asia. It's funny because people tend to think that the things happening in their time are always something new. But if you look at the history of the 19th century, you'll see how it replicates the entire 20th century, and much of what we see today seems to repeat itself. In the 19th century, just like in the 20th, we have a European continental power trying to unify the European continent from the center. With that, two marginal forces, one oceanic and the other terrestrial, cooperate to prevent that from happening. And when that European power fails, these two larger marginal poles then start to compete with each other for global influence. So that's the point we need to focus on. In summary, the Great Game saw the actions of a major Atlanticist oceanic power center, which was London, coming into collision with the land power center, which was Moscow. It's basically a repetition of the Cold War, only now with Washington replacing London and the Soviet Union replacing the Russian Empire. And look at the irony, over time, Soviet foreign policy ended up being the same as that of the Russian Empire, which they used to criticize so much. And the geopolitical authors who influenced the United States, like Mackinder and Julian Corbett, were English. That's why, when we see statements from Russian leaders, they don't mention the United States or England specifically. Notice that, but they talk about the Anglo-Saxons. And their point of view makes a lot of sense. And bringing this to what would be this Second Cold War, which, as I said before, would more accurately be called the Third Great Game, could we now replace Moscow with Beijing? Because once again we have a maritime power on the edge of the Eurasian continent competing against a land-based continental force on the other edge of the Eurasian continent. So the First Cold War was actually the Second Great Game, and this one that the media calls the Second Cold War would be called the Third Great Game. Or you could say that this is the Third Cold War, with the other moments being the First and Second Cold War. Feel free to choose. This perspective makes much more sense because, again, ideology is what matters least here. What's really important is the struggle for power and influence in geopolitics. I have no doubt that historians in the future, centuries or maybe even thousands of years from now, will see the United States as a continuation of the British Empire with a brief split. Just as we today look back 2,000 years and see Constantinople and Rome as both being parts of the same Roman Empire, just with an administrative division before the fall of the Western Roman Empire, London and Washington in the future will be seen as part of the same geopolitical entity. As time goes by and our view of this scenario becomes more distant and therefore broader, they will be seen as parts of the same empire. The same does not apply to China and Russia, which are not the same civilization and have very few connections. At first, It might even seem that the logic I mentioned doesn't make much sense. After all, there wasn't a great war that made the United States and China cooperate and then divide the world, but there almost was. Because after the events I mentioned of an almost war between China and the Soviet Union at the Ussuri River, what did the United States do to contain this land-based geopolitical force that would be marginal in the European scenario but central in the Eurasian scenario? They sought to cooperate with China, which from a Eurasian perspective would be a marginal force. Just as Moscow is to Europe, Beijing would be the equivalent for Eurasia. The reason for this repetition is simple. Geopolitics is geography influencing the behavior of states and defining the arena in which they will compete. But then comes the question, using this historical background from the past, could we predict who will be victorious in this dispute in the future? Unfortunately, no, because even though the actors repeat this geopolitical pattern, the elements and tools they have at their disposal are different. China is different from the Russian Empire and the Soviet Union in a much broader sense. They are less militaristic but much more commercial and industrial, older, more patient, and have a much greater long-term vision, which is a different element from the two previous Cold Wars or Great Games. And while the British Empire was at the height of its power during the first Great Game, and the United States was at the height of its power during the Second Great Game, now that's not the case. The United States is far from its peak. If we consider the British Empire and the United States as being part of the same empire or geopolitical structure, which, by the way, is not just my own idea because other geopoliticians, especially English and American ones, have thought this way, then this organization would not only not be at its peak, but would be undergoing a profound change in its configuration and characteristics similar to the final days of the Roman Empire. Because they are becoming less commercial, less industrial, more burdened by taxes, with more internal conflicts, which was different during the period of their peak. But on the other hand, geography still favors them, which is the fact that they enjoy the agility and isolation that only a naval empire could have, which is being able to choose with whom they will start a war, when they will start that war, where they will fight it, and how they will fight that war. So, within this broad historical and geopolitical perspective, I don't think we should be talking about a second Cold War, but rather the third war of the same civilization of marginal oceanic forces against Eurasian land forces, this being part of the same historical moment, but subdivided into 3 episodes. Thank you all, I hope you enjoyed it, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel, turn on the notification bell, and share the video with everyone you know. Your support is essential for me to keep bringing geopolitical content to you. And don't forget to check out my other channel, Horizonte Futuristas, where I cover science fiction topics in a technical and realistic way. Hugs, and see you in the next video.